Chapter 3. The enamel of Tegan's teeth was hard against her knuckles. She and Kenilworth stood at the end of the sarcophagus. In front of them, Nissa's bandaged body lay silent and still. The doctor had finished unwrapping her head and was leaning into the casket. His right hand was against Nissa's cheek, her hair spread dry and dusty over his fingers. With his other hand, he was pinching the bridge of his nose, head back and eyes tight shut in concentration. Suddenly, the doctor moved. He took a deep, rasping breath, opened his eyes, and stretched. Then he yawned, blinked, and smiled broadly at Tegan. "That should do it," he said with evident satisfaction. "She's going to be okay?" The doctor nodded. "Yes, a bit tired when she eventually wakes, but otherwise fine." He laughed and made his way along the casket, clapping Tegan on the shoulder as soon as he was within reach. "Ironic, really. 4,000 years asleep and she'll be tired." He walked over to the fire and held out his hands to warm them. Kenilworth and Tegan laughed with him. "Well, that's that then, eh, Doctor? Glad it's finally over, I must say." "I'll stay with her till she wakes," Tegan said quietly. The doctor turned back from the fire. "Ah," he said. "Actually, there are a couple of things I should mention. I'm afraid it's not over. Not yet. And I don't think you'll want to wait here for Nissa to wake up." "Doctor, I want to be with her when she comes round. She should see a friendly face." The doctor drew a deep breath. "I doubt it would actually be very friendly, Tegan." "What do you mean?" The doctor started a slow tour of the room. He picked up ornaments and ran his finger over dust-free surfaces, avoiding meeting Tegan's gaze as he spoke. "Nissa's been in a deep coma for a very, very long time. It's rather like a diver going down to the deepest depths. The body adjusts to the changing conditions, and the deeper you go and the longer you stay there, the more slowly you have to return to the surface." "Pressure?" Kenilworth asked. "Something like that, yes. Oxygen levels in the blood, pressure, whatever. In Nissa's case, her metabolic rate has been so slow for so long that it would be fatal to wake her up too quickly. We have to raise the levels slowly. Very slowly, in fact." "So it'll be a while before she wakes up?" The doctor nodded. "How long?" "Well, longer than you'd want to wait here, I think, Tegan. I can't say exactly, but I've aimed for a good round figure. Should be accurate to within a minute or two." 24 hours? The doctor sucked in his cheeks and examined the frame of a particularly interesting portrait. "A week more like," Kenilworth suggested. "A week more like," Kenilworth suggested. "As the doctor says, it'll be a very slow process." "A week?" Tegan crossed to where the doctor was now admiring the canvas. "Doctor, do we really have to wait a whole week to see if Nissa's all right?" He seemed to realise Tegan was talking to him only when she tugged at his sleeve. "A week? Oh, no, nothing like that." He returned his attention to the picture. "More like a century," he muttered. "Just look at the brushwork on that." Tegan had never liked brandy, but she seemed to be drinking a lot of it recently. She gulped down the glassful that Atkins brought her. She was sitting on an upright chair beside the sofa where Kenilworth and the doctor were comparing notes on the quality of the port. Her hands were shaking, and she was barely aware of their conversation. "Doctor," Kenilworth said at length, his tone becoming more serious. "Really take 100 years for your friend to awaken?" The doctor nodded. He drained the last of his port and held the glass up so that the firelight was caught dancing in its facets. "Could I ask you a favour?" "Of course." "It's a big favour," he warned. Kenilworth shrugged. "Doctor, I owe you my life several times over. Whatever it is, it's not a big favour for you to ask." "I don't want to know. No details, please." "And the favour?" The doctor stood and placed his empty glass on the mantel shelf. "Look after our friend until she wakes." "I don't think I'll be here when she wakes, Doctor. I don't think any of us will." "Maybe not," the doctor said hesitantly, shooting Tegan a warning look. "But perhaps you could make arrangements of some sort. She must be kept level and undisturbed." Kenilworth thought for a while, sipping at his port. Eventually he nodded. "There is a cellar we don't use. I'll have it cleared out and she can rest down there. We'll block off access except for a trapdoor or something. I'll arrange for the responsibility for her safety to be passed on to someone I can trust when the time comes." "Thank you," the doctor smiled. "Now, I'd better wrap Nissa's head again. The bandages are impregnated with various chemicals which help preserve the tissue over the years. She'd never forgive me if she woke up with wrinkles." He grinned as Tegan managed a half-smile. When he had finished, the doctor sat down beside Kenilworth again. "There is just one other small thing," he said, patting his pockets. "Oh?" The doctor took a card from his pocket. It was the printed invitation to the unwrapping. He held it up so that both Kenilworth and Tegan had a good view of it. Then he ripped it in half, taking care to make the edge ragged and uneven. He handed one half to Kenilworth. 100 years from now, the doctor said, someone will come for the body, will come to see Nissa when she wakes. Tegan looked up from her empty brandy glass. Kenilworth nodded. "I understand," he said. "And to identify themselves," the doctor nodded, "they will bring the matching half of the invitation." Citamun had been a handmaiden in the temple of Nephthys since she was a child. Her father had been a priest of the temple, and his father before him. Citamun's elder brother was also a priest, and his son would doubtless follow the same calling. But Citamun was blessed above them all, for she was a handmaiden to the returned goddess herself. And whatever might be written or said about the goddess Nephthys, this incarnation seemed kind and gentle. The scribe followed Citamun into the temple chamber. Together they kissed the floor in front of the goddess. "I wish you wouldn't do that," the goddess said again. She leaned forward on her throne and waved them away. The chair was wooden, with high arms and a low back. The seat and back of the chair were painted crimson, and the rest was leafed in gold. Citamun smiled and bowed. She knew she was being tested. Not to show due honour would be to invite the legendary wrath of the goddess. The goddess was in a quiet mood. She did not speak of the strange things she had mentioned when she first appeared to them, and she seemed less distracted and annoyed than previously. Perhaps she was coming to terms with her earthly manifestation. Citamun stood to the side while the scribe set up his wooden pallet. "Who is this?" Citamun bowed low. "He is a junior draftsman, my goddess." "And what is he doing?" "He is here to make a drawing of you." The draftsman smiled nervously and held up the red ochre, reed brush, and plaster sketchpad. "I am merely to capture the outline of the goddess," he bowed. "Why?" "Why? I'm sorry, I do not understand." The goddess leaned back heavily in her chair and sighed. "Why?" she repeated. "What for?" "So that the senior draftsman can correct it with his black ink, and the painters may paint it." The goddess said nothing for a while. The draftsman began to draw his grid on the pad. Citamun hoped that the answer had satisfied the goddess. "Then what? What is the painting for?" The goddess seemed to be making an effort to keep her voice low and calm. Concentrating on trying to understand the question and the mood of the goddess, Citamun answered without thinking. As soon as she had started to speak, she remembered the warning of the high priest, reiterated by the priest Amosis. But it was too late. The words were out. "For the lid of your sarcophagus, my goddess," she said. "For your funeral and burial tomorrow." Atkins was discussing the arrangements for the next day with Miss Warne when the bell rang. They had gone over the menus for the day and had exchanged views on the performance and demeanour of the new scullery maid. Atkins enjoyed their talks at the end of each day, though of course he could never tell Miss Warne that. The very suggestion that he might derive some satisfaction, other than purely professional, from such discussions was out of the question, but he did not wish to burden Miss Warne with that possibility. The flag showed that it was the bell pull in the drawing-room. "If you'll excuse me, Miss Warne," Atkins said as he rose, "I shall attend to his lordship." "I should have thought he'd already retired for the night," Miss Warne said. Atkins felt a little discomforted to sense her gaze on him as he crossed to the door. He turned back, ignoring the brief smile Miss Warne flashed him, and deliberately failed again to notice how perfectly her dark hair framed her oval face. If he were ever to compliment her, it would be on her professionalism, or perhaps her choice of correct attire, rather than any cosmetic appearance. But aware that perhaps his eyes had lingered too long on the pale skin and the dark eyes, he decided a mild rebuke was more in order. "It is not for us to question the habits of his lordship, or to try to predict his timetable," Atkins said sternly. Then he turned and walked stiffly and quickly from the room. If he knew that Miss Warne was watching him as he traversed the corridor, his deliberate stride did not indicate it. "Ah, Atkins," Lord Kenilworth greeted his butler as he entered the drawing-room. Kenilworth was standing in front of the dying fire, staring into the last embers as they glowed weakly in the grate. "Sir?" "Deuced annoying." Kenilworth turned to face Atkins. "The Doctor and Miss Tegan have just left, on their way back to the British Museum for whatever reason." "Indeed, sir." "Fact is, what with one thing and another, all those instructions and so forth." Kenilworth's voice trailed off as he looked across the room at the open sarcophagus. "Instructions, sir?" Oh yes, lots of them. We'll sort it out in the morning, I think. Anyway, meantime, I forgot to ask the Doctor whether we should replace the lid on the sarcophagus. He didn't say, but you never know." Atkins waited patiently for his master to elaborate. He had little idea what Lord Kenilworth was talking about, but it was not his place to ask. His lordship always knew best. "Well, anyway, the lids of the British Museum in any case, along with all the other relics we donated to poor old Russell Evans for his collection there. So perhaps you could catch up with the Doctor, or even meet him there and ask." "Of course, sir." Atkins wondered if it was still snowing outside. He would need a coat for sure, like last night. "Sorry to send you out in this beastly cold again tonight, but, might be important." "No problem at all, sir." Perhaps Miss Warne would oblige by waiting up and organising some hot soup for when he returned. It had been most welcome the previous night. He really ought to have thanked her, he supposed, but at the time it seemed quite natural that she should provide some warm sustenance. "Good man," Kenilworth said. Atkins took this as a dismissal and saw himself out. As she slowly ascended the staircase, in marked contrast to their race down it the previous night, Tegan reflected that at last they were doing something. That said, she was not entirely sure what it was. Partly, this was because of the Doctor's inability to answer straight questions with a straight answer, and partly it was because her mind was still dulled by shock and the after-effects of the brandy. But, for the first time since Nyssa had disappeared, Tegan felt the Doctor was displaying some sense of purpose and deliberation rather than rushing from one enigma to another. Everything seemed to be going well. The Doctor was in a good mood, whistling his way through the light sprinkling of snow. The side door to the museum was, by some miracle, unlocked, and nobody challenged them as they made their way back up to the Egyptian room. But then they opened the door and went in. The room glowed. Light flickered and spilled out onto the stairway as soon as the doctor opened the door. They stepped hesitantly over the threshold and looked around. Every spare surface seemed to have a candle set upon it. Most had burned a good way down, some had burned themselves out into pools of congealed smouldering wax. The air hung with the smoke and the smell. "Someone's being busy," the doctor commented quietly as he made his way further into the room. Tegan followed. "I'll say. What's going on?" The doctor shrugged. "Wish I knew." He grinned at her through the smoky air. "Perhaps one of the mummies has a birthday and they thought they'd celebrate." "Yeah," said Tegan. "Sure. They'll be doing the Monster Mash next." The doctor rocked back on his heels and exhaled loudly. "I hope not," he said. Then he spun round and headed off down the room. "Still, it'll have to keep," he called back as he went. Tegan started to speak, then changed her mind. She shook her head and set off after him. "Looks like a cheap remake of Tales from the Crypt," she muttered, scowling at a sarcophagus lid standing upright against the wall as she passed. Then she stopped in mid-stride, turned, and went back. She peered through the smoke haze at the face on the sarcophagus lid. Then she shook her head again, blinked several times, and went closer. "Look at this, Doctor," she called. Tegan, what is it now?" the doctor asked as he spun round and headed back towards her. "Look, Doctor! Look at the face!" "It's just a sarcophagus," the doctor said, not bothering to look. "They painted representations of the, what shall we say, owners." He followed Tegan's gaze and peered at the face painted on the lid. "Some of the paintings were actually quite good," he said slowly. Then he went closer and looked again. Finally, he reached out and flicked a grubby handkerchief over the cracked paintwork. "Actually, it reminds me of someone," he said, puzzled. "If only I could remember who." He stared again at the female face, framed by curled brown hair. Unusual for her not to be wearing a straight wig. "Doctor," said Tegan quietly, "it's Nissa." The doctor spun round instantly. "Where?" he demanded, looking round the room. "There," Tegan pointed. "The painting." The doctor looked again. "Do you know," he said after a while, "I think you're right. This must be the lid of Kenilworth's sarcophagus. I wonder how it got here." "You should know," a deep voice said. "Doctor." It came from somewhere behind Tegan. "I'm sorry?" The doctor and Tegan both turned to see who had spoken. As if on cue, figures stepped out of the shadows all round the room. They were cloaked and hooded, each holding a candle. The guttering flames threw sharp shadows across their faces, making them look to Tegan like characters escaped from a Munch painting. "Sorry," said the doctor as he and Tegan backed away. "We didn't mean to interrupt. Please just carry on with whatever you were doing." "We'll see ourselves out," Tegan suggested. But the leading figure shook his head beneath his hood. "Oh no," he said in his deep accented voice. "I think now that you are here we can find some role for you to play in our humble proceedings, don't you?" He waved an arm, and dark figures leapt forward from either side, grabbing the doctor and Tegan and dragging them into the centre of the room. Tegan struggled, kicking and trying to pull her arms free, but she was hampered by her own cloak and the restrictions of her Victorian dress. She could do little to prevent herself from being dragged across the room. "At least they're taking us towards the TARDIS," she hissed to the doctor. "I'm not sure that helps, actually," the doctor replied through gritted teeth. "Careful with that elbow," he warned one of his captors as he was wrenched away. The shout came from the doorway, loud and clear, commanding and confident. "Stop that, do you hear?" Another figure, tall and thin, stepped into the candlelight. "These people are colleagues and friends of Lord Kenilworth, and you will answer to him if they are mistreated." "Indeed?" asked the leader of the cloaked figures. "Yes, sir, indeed." The leader laughed. "The Admirable Atkins. I think perhaps you had better join our revels." Before he had time to react, two more silhouettes stepped from the shadows by the door and dragged him over to join the doctor and Tegan. "Good plan," Tegan said. Atkins seemed a little flustered. "What the devil? What do these people want with us, Doctor?" "I'm not sure yet, but I'm afraid Tegan is right. You would have been better advised to make a run for it." By now, the Doctor, Tegan and Atkins had been dragged to the far end of the room. They were facing the sarcophagus which Tegan had seen glow the previous night. Behind them, the TARDIS stood stark and unobtainable. "How kind of you all to join us," the leader of the assailants said. "I feel I know you so well that perhaps I should introduce myself." "Yes," Tegan told him, "perhaps you should." "I am Sadan Rasul, servant and high priest." "Really?" asked the doctor. "Of whom?" "Of the one true goddess, despised and rejected by her brother and her nephew, but her time is coming soon," Rasul whispered. "Very soon now." "Well, I have nothing booked for the next few years," the doctor hazarded. "I'm happy to wait around for an audience. How about you two?" he asked Tegan and Atkins. "I fear Miss Warne will have some broth waiting," Atkins said seriously. "And, of course, his lordship will wish to know that I conveyed his message to you." "Silence," Rasul hissed. "Your time is over." He stepped closer to them and threw back the hood of his cloak. Beneath it, he was completely bald, the candlelight reflecting off the top of his head almost like a halo. The skin of his face was smooth, but Tegan could see faint hairline cracks just visible below the surface, as if his head were made of porcelain and the cracks ran under the glaze. "You know," Rasul said, "how Osiris was tricked by Seth and placed inside a casket which fitted him exactly." "No?" said Tegan. "Yes," said the doctor. "I do recall something of the sort." Atkins nodded. Rasul ignored them all anyway. "The casket was sealed and thrown into the river." He paused and looked at his captives closely. "A fitting fate for those who seek to deny the goddess her freedom, her life." "What makes you think we'd do a thing like that, eh?" "Don't be facetious, Doctor," Rasul snapped angrily. "I was there. I saw all that you did, but it will come to nothing now. The process is started. The goddess will live again." "You do take your religion very seriously, don't you?" Rasul's answer was quiet, almost whispered. "You don't know how seriously, Doctor. You just don't know." He shook his head almost sadly. Then he straightened up and snapped his fingers like a whip cracking. Immediately, Rasul's followers started herding their prisoners across the room. As they retreated, Tegan looked behind her and saw that they were being driven towards a group of several large sarcophagi leaned against the wall. She felt a sudden tightness against the back of her legs, and with a crash, the rope barrier fell over behind them. Before long, their backs were pressed against a hard, cold wooden surface. In front of them, Rasul raised his arms high above his head. "As the legend said," he cried out, "they shall be sealed forever in a fitting coffin and cast into the flowing depths." He turned towards the darkest shadows in the corner of the room, as if to get some confirmation or assurance. And it seemed to Tegan that an even darker shape within the shadows nodded its approval. Tegan could see the doctor reaching out behind himself to try and keep his balance, felt the lid of the sarcophagus behind her move aside, and saw Atkins tumbled backwards into the darkness. With a cry, She followed, the doctor a moment after her. She could hear Rasul's laughter echo round the room outside as the door slammed shut on them. The snow had stopped falling, but the fog was heavy. The torches held by Rasul's followers glowed eerily in the thick night as they made their way along the deserted streets. It took 8 of them to carry the heavy sarcophagus, holding it on their shoulders like pallbearers. They made their cumbersome way down towards the river, their path lit by the 2 lines of cloaked figures ahead of them. Rasul and another, darker figure followed behind. When it reached the bridge, the procession slowed and halted. The bearers turned so that they held the sarcophagus out over the parapet. "So be it," said Rasul, his voice all but lost in the fog. And the men carrying the casket let it drop into the river below. Rasul and the other figure leaned out over the edge. As they watched, the casket resurfaced, water sliding off its lid. Then it sank back into the river, almost disappearing from sight as it was swept downstream. It turned slowly as it was washed away out of the torchlight. "It is done," breathed Rasul, although he did not sound as if it was a relief. "I have just one more journey to make," the figure beside him croaked huskily. It turned and, in the flickering torchlight, Rasul could see inside the hood the figure wore. "But for you, it continues." Rasul nodded. "But the end is approaching," he said, unable to look away from the ruined remains of the figure's hooded face, trying not to inhale the stench of rotting flesh. "Soon the goddess will live again." In the kitchen of Kenilworth House, Susan Warne stirred a pot of vegetable broth and wondered where Henry Atkins had got to. Perhaps this evening he would thank her for her efforts. She knew that almost certainly he would not. But there was just a possibility that he might value her kindness, might show her some appreciation. The Legend of Horus. The sarcophagus bore the body of Osiris down the great river, the Nile. It travelled for many days, until it washed up on the shores of the river at Byblos. The sarcophagus stuck fast in a hollow tree by the flowing water, and there it remained while Seth ruled the kingdoms of Egypt in his brother's place. But Isis searched along the Nile for her husband's body. After many days she found the casket, and she put it back to Egypt and concealed it in the marshes. Disguised as a kite, Isis visited the hidden body of her brother husband. Each day she tried to breathe new life into the bones of Osiris. She spoke the words of power, the spells she learned from Thoth. And Osiris stirred in death and began to reawaken. As he slowly recovered and gained strength, Osiris remained hidden in the marshes of Egypt. After a while Isis conceived, and was with child by her husband. But Seth discovered his brother was again alive, and ordered that Osiris be found. And when his soldiers had found where Osiris was hidden, Seth had his brother torn to pieces, and he scattered his brother's remains into the river Nile. Isis wept again for her husband, and again she searched along the river for him. She spent many days and months until she had recovered all the pieces of her brother's body. Then she placed them together, reforming his once noble form, and she bound it together with strips of linen, the first mummy. So Osiris became an Ankh, travelling down to the underworld to become king of the dead. Meanwhile, on earth, Isis gave birth to the son of Osiris, and she called him Horus, the falcon who sees all. Until he came of age, Isis trained Horus in the arts of war, and taught him the wisdom of his father. When the day came that Horus ascended to adulthood, he went to his uncle Seth, and he challenged him for the throne of Osiris. The gods watched the conflict that followed, and they helped Horus to avenge his father. Seth and his sister wife Nephthys were defeated and imprisoned, and the gods declared Horus the rightful king of all Egypt. Translated by Tobias Singent from the inscriptions on the tomb of An-Acha.